Okay, so before we get into the deep stuff, and trust me, it gets very deep, let us talk about something simple, something you can picture in your mind right now. Imagine you are standing at the very bottom of the world. Not metaphorically, literally. You are standing on ice so thick, so ancient, so impossibly heavy, that the rock underneath has been pressed down below sea level, just by the weight of it. The sky above you is a brutal, endless gray, and the wind is not blowing so much as screaming. Not the kind of wind that ruffles your hair, the kind that tears at your clothes, fills your lungs with frozen air, and makes it genuinely hard to think clearly. The temperature is not 10 degrees below zero, not 20, not even 50. We're talking about places on this continent where temperatures have been recorded at minus 89 degrees Celsius, minus 128 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest temperature ever measured on the surface of the Earth. That is where we are going tonight, Antarctica. And here is the thing that nobody really stops to think about, because we have all been taught to just accept it as a normal part of the world map. This continent, this enormous landmass at the bottom of everything, is larger than the United States and Mexico combined. It holds approximately 90% of all the freshwater ice on the planet. It is the highest, driest, windiest, and coldest continent on Earth. Some parts of it have not had rain in over 2 million years, and yet, somehow, you almost never see it on a normal map. Think about the maps you grew up with in school. North America, South America, Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia. Antarctica, if it appears at all, is usually a thin white strip at the very bottom of the page, cut off, like it is not important enough to include properly. That choice, the choice to literally push Antarctica to the margins, is something we are going to come back to. Because when you start pulling on the threads around this continent, you discover that the way Antarctica is treated by governments, by militaries, by international law, is unlike how any other place on Earth has ever been treated. And that is where this story begins. Not with the ice, not with the penguins, not even with the cold. It begins with a question so simple it sounds almost naive. Why do the world's most powerful governments treat Antarctica differently from every other piece of land on Earth? Because they do. They absolutely do. And the answer to that question takes you through one of the most extraordinary stories in modern history. A story involving secret military operations, a hidden Nazi base, ancient maps that should not exist, buried lakes sealed off from the world for millions of years, oil reserves large enough to change the balance of global power, and an international legal agreement so unusual that lawyers and historians are still arguing about what it really means. We are going to walk through all of it tonight, one piece at a time, and at the end, you can decide for yourself what to make of it. Here is something interesting to start with. Antarctica was the last continent on Earth to be discovered by modern humans. And when I say discovered, I mean officially, formally, written down in history books, discovered. Because there are reasons to believe the story is more complicated than that. The official account goes like this. In January 1820, three separate expeditions were sailing through the far southern waters. A Russian expedition under Fabian von Bellingshausen spotted ice-covered land. A British expedition under Edward Bransfield did the same. An American sealing expedition under Nathaniel Palmer also reported land in the area. None of them set foot on the continent itself that season. The first people to actually walk on Antarctic soil are believed to have been crew members of an American sealing ship in 1821. So 1820 is the official year of discovery. The age of the great explorations had already been going on for nearly 4 centuries by then. Europeans had crossed the Atlantic, found the Americas, sailed around Africa and India, mapped most of the Pacific, but they missed Antarctica until 1820. Now, why? The ocean that surrounds Antarctica is genuinely terrifying. It is the only ocean on Earth that circles the globe without any continental barrier. It builds up the most powerful currents and the most violent seas anywhere on the planet. Ships that ventured far enough south encountered storms that could swallow them, iceberg fields the size of small countries, and cold that could kill a man in minutes if he went overboard. It is not hard to understand why most sailors stayed away. But here is the complication. Here is the thread that historians and cartographers have been pulling on for decades. In 1513, an Ottoman admiral and cartographer named Piri Reis created a world map. This map survives today. You can see photographs of it. It shows detailed coastlines of South America, the Atlantic, and Africa. But it also shows a coastline at the bottom of the map, south of South America and Africa, that some researchers have argued depicts Antarctica. Piri Reis himself wrote notes on the map stating it was compiled from older source maps, some of which, according to his own annotation, dated back to ancient times. A retired American history professor named Charles Hapgood argued in the 1960s that the southern coastline on the Piri Reis map showed the coast of Antarctica without its ice, meaning it depicted the continent's actual rock shoreline, which would only have been ice-free thousands of years ago, before the last ice age fully set in. If that were true, it would mean someone, some civilization, had not only visited Antarctica, but mapped it in detail thousands of years before 1820. Most professional cartographers and historians are skeptical, and their skepticism is reasonable. But here is the honest position. There is genuine academic debate about this. It is not a closed question. And whether or not the Piri Reis map actually shows Antarctica, the question it raises is a genuinely fascinating one. How much do we actually know about who first encountered this continent? And if someone did reach it long before 1820, why does the official account begin where it does? By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Antarctica had become an obsession for the great colonial powers of the world. Not because anyone fully understood what was there, but because of a principle that had governed European politics for centuries. If you discover it, you claim it. The age of Antarctic exploration produced some of the most dramatic and heartbreaking stories in the history of human adventure. Robert Falcon Scott, the British naval officer, led 2 expeditions to Antarctica. His second, beginning in 1910, became a tragedy that the whole world felt. Scott and his team reached the South Pole on January 17, 1912, only to find that the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen had beaten them there. By 34 days, Amundsen had left behind a tent with a Norwegian flag and a letter addressed to Scott. Then, on the return journey, Scott and his 4 companions all died from cold, exhaustion, and starvation within a few miles of a supply depot that could have saved them. Scott's final diary entries were recovered along with his body months later. They reveal a man of extraordinary courage, facing an agonizing end with remarkable composure. His last written words, reportedly, were, "For God's sake, look after our people." Amundsen, the Norwegian who beat Scott to the pole, took a more methodical approach. Careful route planning, the use of sled dogs, sensible clothing. He reached the South Pole on December 14, 1911, planted a Norwegian flag, and returned safely. Then there was Shackleton. When his ship, the Endurance, became trapped in the sea ice of the Weddell Sea in 1915 and was eventually crushed, Shackleton led his entire crew of 28 men through over a year of survival on the ice. A treacherous open boat journey across 500 miles of the world's most dangerous ocean. A crossing of the uncharted mountains of South Georgia Island. all without losing a single man. The Endurance was lost, but every single crew member survived. The wreck of the Endurance was only found in 2022, lying on the seabed of the Weddell Sea at a depth of 3,000 meters, remarkably well preserved by the cold Antarctic waters. The ship's name still clearly visible on the stern. These early expeditions were not just about adventure and glory. They were explicitly about staking national claims. Britain, Norway, France, Australia, New Zealand, and Argentina all began asserting territorial rights. Some of them overlapped with each other, creating potential flashpoints for conflict. And then something strange happened. The nations with competing and overlapping territorial ambitions agreed to set those ambitions aside. Which brings us to the question that should be bothering you right now. Why? On December 1st, 1959, 12 nations gathered in Washington, D.C., and signed the Antarctic Treaty. The original 12 signatories were Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Chile, France, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Today, 54 nations are parties to this agreement. Let us put this in historical context, because the timing matters enormously. The year 1959 was right in the thick of the Cold War. The Soviet Union had launched Sputnik just 2 years earlier, shocking the Western world into a panicked reassessment of its technological position. The United States was conducting nuclear tests. The Soviet Union was conducting nuclear tests. Berlin was divided. The Korean War had ended 6 years earlier. The world was a powder keg. And Washington and Moscow were the two hands holding most of the matches. And yet, somehow, in that specific moment of maximum global tension, the United States and the Soviet Union, along with 10 other nations, sat down and agreed to share an entire continent. They agreed to make it nuclear weapons free. They agreed to ban military operations. They agreed to allow any signatory nation to inspect any other nation's Antarctic facilities at any time with no advance notice required. Read that again. Any nation can send inspectors to any other nation's Antarctic research station without asking permission first. In 1959, during the Cold War, the United States agreed that Soviet officials could walk into any American facility in Antarctica unannounced. Does that sound like any other international agreement you have ever heard of? Because it does not sound like one to me. Nations guard their military and research facilities with extraordinary jealousy. Inspection rights are negotiated for months or years, hedged with exceptions and conditions, and even then they are often resisted and evaded. The International Atomic Energy Agency still fights with nations like Iran and North Korea to get any kind of inspection access at all. But Antarctica? Sure, come on in, no notice required. The official explanation is that the treaty was born from the spirit of international scientific cooperation, and that explanation is probably part of the truth. But there is another part of the picture that deserves attention, because what both superpowers were actually doing in Antarctica during this period was establishing a military-grade strategic presence, mapping the continent, studying the ice, and assessing exactly what was there, and what both sides may have concluded, more or less simultaneously, is that whatever was in Antarctica was too significant and too destabilizing to become the property of any single nation. That is speculation, but it is informed speculation, and it fits the facts of the treaty much better than the purely idealistic account does. Before the Antarctic Treaty made everything orderly and scientific and peaceful, there was a moment when the United States sent the largest naval task force in the history of Antarctic exploration to the continent. And the official explanation for why they did it has never fully satisfied historians. Operation Highjump launched in August 1946 under the command of Rear Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd. This was not a small scientific expedition. The task force included 13 ships, including an aircraft carrier, 2 seaplane tenders, a submarine, 2 destroyers, 2 tankers, and an icebreaker. It carried approximately 4,700 military personnel and 33 aircraft. The operation was originally planned to last 6 to 8 months. It was cut short, and the entire task force withdrew after only about 8 weeks in Antarctic waters. The official explanation is that deteriorating weather and ice conditions made it necessary to pull out early. Now, weather and ice conditions in Antarctica are genuinely challenging, but an operation of this scale, with this much planning, this much preparation, this much equipment, being called off after less than 2 months, that raised eyebrows at the time, and has raised them ever since. What is documented is that the expedition did encounter serious accidents and losses. 3 aircraft were lost during operations, with deaths among crew members. What is not verified but is widely circulated are claims that the task force encountered some kind of opposition or resistance. Some conspiracy accounts describe unidentified aircraft, underwater craft, military engagements, for which there is no official documentation. No credible documentation has ever surfaced to support these claims. But here is what is genuinely interesting and documented. Admiral Byrd, after returning from Operation Highjump, gave a press conference. He spoke about the strategic military importance of Antarctica and made a warning that has been quoted, debated, and interpreted in many different ways ever since. He stated that in the event of a new war, the United States could be attacked by aircraft flying over one or both poles. He emphasized the need for the United States to maintain a strong presence in the region. There are also documents purported to be extracts from a secret Byrd diary, which began circulating after his death. These documents describe encounters with a civilization living beneath the Antarctic ice, flying over lush green landscapes, meeting beings of advanced intelligence beneath the ice. Here is where I am going to be straight with you. The so-called Byrd secret diary that circulates online has never been authenticated. There is no credible chain of custody for these documents. Byrd's actual personal papers do not contain these entries. The Hollow Earth diary is almost certainly a fabrication. But the fabrication does something interesting. It took a real operation, a genuinely massive, genuinely mysterious early withdrawal military expedition to Antarctica, and wove around it a story that, while fictional, tapped into something real. The sense that Operation Highjump was about more than mapping coastlines. And that sense is not unreasonable. Now we need to talk about one of the most enduring and controversial chapters in the whole Antarctica story. The claim that Nazi Germany established a secret base on the continent before and during the Second World War. This claim is usually called Base 211, or sometimes New Swabia. Here is what is actually, factually, documented and not in dispute. In 1938 and 1939, the Nazi government sent an expedition to Antarctica. The expedition ship was called the Schwabenland. The stated purpose was to survey an area of Antarctica that Germany intended to claim as a territory. They called it Neuschwabenland, New Swabia, located in what is now called Queen Maud Land. The expedition was real. It is in the historical record. German aircraft flew hundreds of aerial survey missions over the region, dropping metal markers with swastika symbols to assert German territorial claims. All of that is documented history. Now, here is where it gets more complicated. The claim that goes far beyond documented history is that during the war years, Germany secretly constructed a large underground base in this same region, using submarine supply lines to transport men, equipment, and materials to Antarctica. The further claim, which has become enormously popular, is that after Germany's defeat in 1945, high-ranking Nazi officials, and perhaps even Hitler himself, escaped to this base where they continued to operate in secret. There are several documented historical facts woven into these claims. It is true that Germany operated an extensive U-boat campaign throughout the war. It is true that some German submarines did operate in the far southern waters. It is also true that a number of high-ranking Nazis did escape Europe after the war through networks of escape routes, using sympathetic communities in Spain, Italy, and South America to move former Nazi officials to places like Argentina and Brazil, where they lived under assumed identities for years. Adolf Eichmann, one of the chief architects of the Holocaust, lived in Argentina under the name Ricardo Clement until Israeli intelligence agents captured him in 1960. But, and this is important, the claim that any of this involved a functioning Nazi base in Antarctica is not supported by credible physical evidence. No confirmed archaeological trace of any such base has been found. A detailed academic study concluded that the Nazi Antarctic base is a myth. The logistical requirements for such an operation across some of the most dangerous ocean in the world, sustained over years of wartime, would have been essentially impossible given Germany's actual naval situation after about 1942. So the Base 211 story, in its dramatic form, a full functioning underground Nazi city in Antarctica, is almost certainly fiction. But the fiction did not come from nowhere. It built on real things. The real 1938 expedition, the real complexity of post-war Nazi escape networks, the real gap in full public documentation of Allied operations in Antarctica during the late 1940s. Someone took those real threads and wove a story around them. And that story has been so pervasive that it has shaped public perception of Antarctic secrecy more than almost anything else. The image is probably wrong, but the impulse behind it, the sense that something about how powerful nations behave toward this continent does not quite add up, is not wrong at all. Let us step back from the conspiracy world for a moment and talk about what Antarctica genuinely is. Scientifically, because understanding the real science helps you understand why governments actually do have very good reasons to treat this continent with extraordinary care, and sometimes with extraordinary secrecy. Antarctica's ice sheet is the most comprehensive natural archive of Earth's climate history that exists anywhere on the planet. In some places, the ice is nearly 5 kilometers thick. That is about 16,000 feet, nearly 3 miles of solid ancient ice. And within those layers, preserved in annual bands like rings in a tree, is a precise chemical record of every single year of Earth's atmospheric history, going back at least 800,000 years. Scientists drill cores from this ice, cylindrical samples that can be up to 3 kilometers long, and when they analyze them, they can read from them the exact chemical composition of the ancient atmosphere, the concentration of carbon dioxide, methane, and other gases, the temperature of the air, evidence of major volcanic eruptions, evidence of changes in ocean circulation. Essentially, everything that has happened to this planet's climate over the past 800 millennia is encoded in those ice layers. What the ice cores tell us is both fascinating and sobering. They show that current levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide, roughly 420 parts per million, are higher than at any point in those 800,000 years of record. The pre-industrial level was roughly 280 parts per million. The highest point in the previous 800,000 years of natural fluctuation was about 300 parts per million. In other words, the ice knows what the climate has been doing for nearly 1 million years, and what the ice knows Is that what humans have done to the atmosphere in the last 2 centuries? Has no precedent in its entire memory. Imagine a lake, not just any lake. A lake that has been completely sealed off from the rest of the world for somewhere between 15 and 25 million years. A lake that has sat in total darkness under 4 kilometers of ice, cut off from sunlight, from the surface atmosphere, from any connection to the biological world above, for longer than the human species has existed, longer than the genus Homo has existed, longer than most of the mammals alive today have existed. That lake is real. It is called Lake Vostok, and it sits beneath the Russian research station of the same name in East Antarctica. Lake Vostok is enormous, approximately 250 kilometers long, 50 kilometers wide, roughly the same surface area as Lake Ontario in North America. It sits beneath approximately 4 kilometers of ice. The water in it has been liquid despite the surrounding ice because of geothermal heat from the rock beneath it. Russian scientists finally reached the lake water in 2012, drilling to a depth of approximately 3,771 meters. What they found in the ice just above the water was extraordinary. It contained genetic material from bacteria and other microorganisms that appeared to be unlike any species previously cataloged. Some of the genetic sequences found did not match anything in existing biological databases, raising the possibility that Lake Vostok hosts genuinely novel forms of life, organisms that have evolved in complete isolation from the rest of Earth's biosphere for millions of years. Let that sit with you for a moment. There may be living things in Lake Vostok that have been evolving, entirely cut off from the rest of life on Earth for longer than humans have existed, and Lake Vostok is not alone. As of the most recent comprehensive surveys, scientists have identified well over 400 subglacial lakes beneath Antarctica's ice. Some are connected to each other through subglacial rivers and channels that move enormous quantities of water beneath the ice sheet. Scientists discovered in 2025 alone that approximately 85 of these lakes are actively draining and filling, meaning the water is moving, not static, with lakes gaining and losing water in cycles measured over years and decades. The whole underside of the Antarctic ice sheet is alive with liquid water, moving, connected, teeming with who knows what. Here is another genuine scientific fact about Antarctica that does not get nearly enough attention, and when you hear it, you will understand why. Buried entirely beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet, hidden under kilometers of ancient glacial ice, with no trace visible at the surface, there is a mountain range, not a small one, a major mountain range, with peaks approaching 3,000 meters above sea level. It is called the Gamburtsev subglacial mountain range, and it is roughly the same size as the European Alps. Nobody has ever seen it. No human eye has ever looked directly at these mountains. They were discovered in the 1950s by Soviet scientists using seismic surveys, essentially bouncing sound waves through the ice and reading the reflections to construct a picture of what lies beneath. The Gamburtsev Range sits in the very interior of East Antarctica, thousands of kilometers from the coast, hidden under 4 to 5 kilometers of ice. Getting a drill close enough to actually penetrate to the mountains is currently beyond our technology. These mountains may remain unvisited by any human for generations to come. If they are ever visited at all, a mountain range the size of the Alps, completely unknown to humanity until the mid-20th century, still never directly observed by any human being, sealed beneath one of the most inaccessible ice sheets on Earth. Antarctica is genuinely full of things like this. Things that should be talked about more, that should be as famous as the pyramids or the Grand Canyon, but which exist in a world so remote and so difficult that even in the modern era of satellites and drilling technology, they remain effectively out of reach. Before we move into the geopolitical material, let us take a moment to visit one of the most visually stunning places on the continent, Taylor Glacier, in the McMurdo dry valleys of East Antarctica. This is where you will find Blood Falls. The name is exactly as dramatic as it sounds. From a crack in the face of the glacier, a slow, steady flow of deep red-orange liquid seeps out and runs down onto the white ice of Lake Bonny below. It looks, from even a short distance, exactly like a glacier bleeding. The dramatic appearance has been known since 1911. The geologist Thomas Griffith Taylor first observed it during the Scott expedition and assumed the red color came from red algae. That explanation held for decades, but it was wrong. The actual explanation is both stranger and more interesting. Beneath Taylor Glacier, there is a reservoir of ancient brine, salt water so salty that it does not freeze even at -10 degrees Celsius. This water has been sealed beneath the glacier for approximately 1.5 million years. It is rich in iron from the bedrock it has been in contact with all that time. And when this iron-laden brine seeps through a crack in the glacier and makes contact with the oxygen in the surface atmosphere, the iron oxidizes. In other words, it rusts. The red color is iron oxide, the same chemistry as rust. What looks like a bleeding glacier is actually a million-year-old brine release, painting the ice red as ancient subglacial chemistry meets the modern atmosphere for the first time in geological ages. And inside that ancient brine, scientists have found living bacteria, microorganisms that have been surviving and reproducing in that cold, salty, oxygen-free, iron-rich environment for over 1 million years, running their metabolism entirely through chemical reactions, rather than photosynthesis, because they have been sealed away from all sunlight. These bacteria have been evolving, isolated, for over 1 million years. The last common ancestor they shared with surface life was alive when Homo erectus was walking the earth, and modern humans did not yet exist. Blood Falls is not just a beautiful geological curiosity. It is a window into a category of life that we are only beginning to understand. Life that does not need sunlight, does not need oxygen, does not need warmth. Life that finds a way in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Now let us address something you have probably seen in an internet headline at some point: the claim that there are pyramids in Antarctica. The pictures are striking. They show what appear to be sharply pointed, four-sided mountain peaks with clean, almost geometrically regular sides that do look, from certain angles and in certain photographs, startlingly like Egyptian or Mesoamerican pyramids. So what is the truth? The truth is that these structures are real geographical features, and their explanation is completely natural. But the natural explanation is itself genuinely interesting. The features are called nunataks. A nunatak is a rocky peak or ridge that projects above the surface of an ice sheet or glacier. The reason some of them have that distinctively pyramidal shape is a geological process called frost action, where water repeatedly freezes in cracks in the rock, expands, and breaks pieces of rock away from the face of the mountain. When this process happens on multiple faces of a mountain simultaneously, it tends to carve the mountain into an increasingly symmetrical, pointed shape. The same process creates the iconic shapes of many high alpine peaks in Switzerland and Austria, including the Matterhorn, which has a similar geometry, for the same reason. So the Antarctica pyramids are not built structures. They are natural rock formations shaped by geological processes over millions of years. The fact that they look like pyramids is a coincidence produced by physics, not by ancient builders. But here is the part that is genuinely interesting, and that does not get enough attention when people debunk the conspiracy version. The Antarctic nunataks that look like pyramids are exposed only because the ice that once covered them has retreated. In other words, the fact that we can see these bare rocky peaks today is itself evidence of glacial change. The ice has pulled back far enough to expose rock that was previously buried. And that raises a different, more real question. What else might become exposed as the Antarctic ice continues to change? Here is a story about Antarctica that sits at the intersection of genuine science, institutional bureaucracy, and something that at least one researcher at the time described as a near cover-up. It is the story of the ozone hole. The ozone layer is a region of Earth's upper atmosphere, roughly 15 to 35 kilometers above the surface, where concentrations of ozone molecules are high enough to absorb most of the ultraviolet radiation coming from the sun. UV radiation at high doses causes skin cancer, cataracts, and immune system damage in humans. It can be deadly to phytoplankton and other small organisms that form the base of marine food chains. The ozone layer is, in a very real sense, part of what makes Earth's surface habitable for life as we know it. In the mid-1970s, chemists Mario Molina and Sherwood Rowland published research demonstrating that chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, chemicals widely used in refrigerators, air conditioners, and aerosol spray cans, were capable of destroying ozone molecules in the upper atmosphere. Molina and Rowland shared the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1995. But here is the Antarctica part of the story. The most dramatic evidence of ozone depletion was not found in the laboratory. It was found directly above Antarctica. British scientists working at the Halley Research Station in Antarctica had been collecting atmospheric data since 1956. In the early 1980s, a scientist named Joe Farman and his colleagues noticed something alarming in their data: a dramatic seasonal drop in ozone concentrations above Antarctica during the southern spring, every year growing worse with each successive year. By the time they published their findings in 1985, the data showed that ozone concentrations above Antarctica in spring had dropped by more than 30%. NASA had a satellite, the Nimbus 7 satellite, launched in 1978, that was collecting global ozone data continuously. When scientists went back and examined the satellite data after the British publication, the ozone depletion over Antarctica was right there in the data. The satellite had been recording it all along, but the ozone drop had been so severe that the computer algorithms processing the satellite data had classified it as an error. The software had been designed with limits on how far readings could deviate from expected values, and the ozone depletion was so extreme that it kept getting flagged as instrument malfunction and discarded rather than recorded. Was this a deliberate cover-up? The honest answer, based on what is documented, is no. The algorithm failure was a technical error, not an intentional suppression. But the consequence of that technical error was that a phenomenon of enormous importance to all life on Earth was being systematically missed in the most sophisticated atmospheric monitoring system in the world. While a small team of British scientists working with ground-based instruments in Antarctica were the ones who actually caught it. The ozone hole story is worth knowing precisely because it demonstrates something important about Antarctica. It is not just a remote curiosity. It is a monitoring station for the health of the planet. Things happen there first, or are most visible there, or can only be measured there. What Antarctica reveals often has consequences for everyone on Earth. Now let us talk about something happening in Antarctica right now. That is genuinely one of the most extraordinary scientific experiments in the history of our species, and which receives almost no mainstream attention whatsoever. Buried beneath the ice at the South Pole is a neutrino detector called IceCube. And I am going to need a moment to explain what a neutrino is, because the IceCube experiment only makes sense once you understand what it is looking for. Neutrinos are subatomic particles, tiny, almost massless, with no electric charge. They are produced in enormous quantities in nuclear reactions, including the reactions that power stars. The Sun produces approximately 10 to the power of 38 neutrinos per second. Right now, approximately 100 trillion neutrinos from the Sun pass through your body every single second. They pass through you, through the Earth, through everything, because they barely interact with ordinary matter at all. A neutrino can pass through a wall of lead 1 light-year thick and still have a 50-50 chance of emerging the other side without having interacted with anything. They are the most ghostly, the most intangible things in the universe, and yet they carry information about the most violent and energetic events in the cosmos. Supernovae, black hole mergers, gamma ray bursts, the cores of active galaxies. IceCube was built specifically to catch these messengers. A volume of approximately 1 cubic kilometer of Antarctic ice has been instrumented with over 5,000 optical sensors drilled down into the ice at depths between 1,400 and 2,400 meters. The ice at that depth is extraordinarily pure and clear because it was compressed and filtered over hundreds of thousands of years. When a high-energy neutrino very occasionally interacts with an atom in the ice, it produces a tiny flash of blue light called Cherenkov radiation. The sensors detect that flash, and from the pattern of which sensors lit up, and when scientists can reconstruct both the energy and the direction of the neutrino that caused it. IceCube has been operating since 2010. In 2017, IceCube helped identify the first known source of high-energy cosmic neutrinos, a blazar called TXS 0506 plus 056, a type of active galaxy with a supermassive black hole at its center, located approximately 3.7 billion light-years from Earth. Think about that. An instrument buried in the Antarctic ice detected a particle that left a galaxy 3.7 billion light-years away, traveled across the cosmos, passed through the entire Earth, and announced its arrival with a tiny flicker of blue light in the dark ice 2 kilometers below the surface of Antarctica. IceCube is, in a very literal sense, a telescope pointed at the deep universe, not through the sky above, but through the earth beneath. There is no conspiracy in IceCube, but it illustrates something profound about what Antarctica means scientifically. This is not just a continent of ice. It is the best place on Earth to look at the universe. Now we arrive at what is probably the most important and most undercovered aspect of the entire Antarctica story for the geopolitics of the coming decades. And this is where the governments do not want you to know framing starts to get closest to something that is not conspiracy, but is genuinely, verifiably real. Antarctica sits on top of an extraordinary concentration of natural resources. The continent itself contains deposits of coal, iron ore, copper, gold, nickel, titanium, and numerous other minerals. The Ross Sea and the Weddell Sea, the two major embayments of the Antarctic coastline, are believed to sit above significant reserves of oil and natural gas. The Protocol on Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty, signed in 1991, prohibits any activity relating to mineral resources in Antarctica, but it contains a review mechanism. It can be reviewed after 50 years, which means the earliest the ban could potentially be lifted is 2041. 2041, that is 15 years from now. And the nations that have been most aggressive about establishing and maintaining territorial claims and physical presence in Antarctica: Russia, China, the United States, Australia, Argentina, Chile, are all nations with both the technical capability to extract resources at the poles and the motivation to be in position when and if the legal barriers change. Russia's Antarctic activities in recent years have attracted particular attention. In 2025, reports emerged that Russia had conducted extensive seismic survey activity in Antarctic waters, surveys of exactly the type used in oil and gas exploration. Some estimates of the petroleum resources in the Antarctic region run to over 500 billion barrels of oil equivalent, a figure that, if accurate, would represent one of the largest untapped hydrocarbon reserves on Earth. China has also significantly increased its Antarctic presence over the past 2 decades. It now operates 5 research stations on the continent, more than any other nation except the United States and Russia. Chinese icebreaker ships have been making regular runs to supply and expand these stations, and the research programs nominally attached to them have attracted scrutiny from Western intelligence analysts, who note that some of the facilities appear to have capabilities, communications infrastructure, antenna arrays, proximity to strategic locations that go beyond what pure scientific research would require. What all of this adds up to is a slow, quiet, decades-long positioning exercise by the world's major powers for a moment that is still 15 years away, but which everyone with a stake in global resource politics is already preparing for. The 2041 review of the mineral ban is, in the view of some analysts, the most important natural resource negotiation of the 21st century, and almost nobody outside specialist circles is paying attention to it. Let us talk about the weights. Because if you want to understand why governments treat Antarctica with such extraordinary caution, if you want to understand why the scientific community dedicates enormous resources to this frozen continent, and if you want to understand the stakes of what happens there, Thwaites is the place to start. The Thwaites Glacier is located in West Antarctica, draining into the Amundsen Sea. It is enormous, roughly the size of the state of Florida, covering approximately 180,000 square kilometers. It flows from the interior of the West Antarctic ice sheet to the coast, where it calves icebergs into the ocean, and it is melting significantly, measurably, and alarmingly fast. Thwaites is sometimes called the Doomsday Glacier, and while that phrase might sound dramatic, the underlying concern is legitimate. West Antarctica sits in a deep basin. The rock beneath it is below sea level in many places, and the ice sheet is in part grounded on bedrock that slopes downward away from the coast toward the interior. This geometry creates conditions for what scientists call marine ice sheet instability. The basic idea is this: when warm ocean water gets under the edges of a marine ice sheet and starts melting it from below, the grounding line begins to retreat inland. But because the bedrock slopes down toward the interior, every time the grounding line retreats, it is sitting on deeper water, which means the ice sheet above it is thicker, which means more ice is available to melt, which means the process accelerates. Once it gets going, it becomes self-reinforcing. For Thwaites specifically, the concern is that significant portions of the glacier are already past what some scientists believe is a tipping point, a threshold of warming and retreat beyond which the collapse process becomes essentially unstoppable on human timescales. Regardless of what we do to reduce emissions from this point forward, the potential consequences are staggering. Thwaites alone contains enough ice that, if it fully melted, global sea levels would rise by approximately 65 centimeters, about 2 feet. But Thwaites also functions as a kind of buttress for neighboring glaciers. If Thwaites fails, it could destabilize adjacent parts of the West Antarctic ice sheet, in a cascade effect that scientists are still working to fully model. The most extreme projections for a full West Antarctic ice sheet collapse over the coming centuries involve sea level rises of 3 to 5 meters. That is roughly 10 to 16 feet, enough to permanently inundate the most densely populated coastal regions on Earth: Miami, Shanghai, Mumbai, Bangladesh, the Netherlands, New Orleans, London. All of them would be profoundly affected, or simply gone. This is not a conspiracy. This is not a theory. This is what the peer-reviewed scientific literature actually says about a real glacier, at the bottom of a real continent, that governments have been quietly monitoring with increasing anxiety for decades. Here is something that surprises a lot of people when they first find out about it. You cannot just go to Antarctica. Most of the continent is not accessible to ordinary people, not because it is physically impossible to reach, but because of a combination of international law, national permit systems, and logistical restrictions that together create something that functions very much like a forbidden zone. The Antarctic Treaty requires that any national of a signatory nation who visits Antarctica must do so under permit or official authorization. Tourism to Antarctica does happen. It has been growing steadily since the 1990s. Each year, roughly 100,000 visitors travel to Antarctic waters and the peninsula on expedition cruise ships. But those tourists are tightly regulated. They must follow strict environmental protocols. They are generally restricted to the Antarctic Peninsula, the finger of land that reaches northward toward South America, which is the most accessible part of the continent, the vast interior of Antarctica, the ice sheets of East Antarctica, the areas around the geographic South Pole beyond the research stations, the subglacial mountain ranges, the lakes, the deep interior valleys, are functionally off limits to anyone who is not part of an officially sanctioned national research program, and even within the scientific community, access is controlled by national Antarctic programs, which means it is controlled by governments. What research gets done, in which locations, with which equipment, by which teams, is ultimately decided by a handful of powerful national programs. Principally, the United States Antarctic Program, the British Antarctic Survey, the Russian Arctic and Antarctic Research Institute, the Australian Antarctic Division, and the Chinese National Antarctic Research Expeditions. Other nations participate, but these are the programs with the most capability, the most infrastructure, and the most influence over what happens on the continent. The transparency mechanisms in the treaty are real. Inspection rights exist, scientific data is supposed to be shared, and in many areas, genuine scientific collaboration and openness does occur. But the overall architecture of how Antarctica is managed is one in which a small number of powerful governments make most of the real decisions about access, about research priorities, about what gets published and what does not. In 2016, IceCube detected something unusual, a neutrino with an energy level so extraordinarily high that it stood out from everything else in the dataset. This event, cataloged as IC17922A, was a high-energy neutrino with an energy of approximately 290 tera-electron volts. That is an almost incomprehensibly large amount of energy for a single subatomic particle. To put it in context, the most powerful particle accelerator ever built, the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, accelerates protons to energies of about 14 tera-electron volts. This single neutrino from deep space, detected by sensors buried in Antarctic ice, carried roughly 20 times more energy than the most powerful machine humans have ever built. Can produce. The event triggered a global alert. IceCube sent automatic notifications to dozens of observatories around the world. Telescopes swiveled to the region of sky the neutrino had come from. Within days, multiple observatories had confirmed that the direction pointed toward TXS 0506 plus 056, a blazar 3.7 billion light-years away, that had just been observed flaring in gamma rays. It was the first time in history that a source of high-energy cosmic neutrinos had been positively identified, and it happened because of an experiment buried in the Antarctic ice. IceCube has since detected more events like this. The field of multi-messenger astronomy, where you combine neutrino data with light and gravitational wave data to build a more complete picture of cosmic events, is one of the fastest-growing fields in modern physics, and Antarctica is at the center of it. The IceCube collaboration is currently planning a next-generation detector called IceCube Gen 2 that would expand the instrumented volume by roughly 10 times, making it sensitive to neutrinos from even more distant and energetic sources. In a very real sense, the future of our understanding of the most extreme events in the universe depends on what we can build and operate in the ice at the bottom of the world. Okay. We have to talk about this because no discussion of why governments might want to control information about Antarctica would be complete without addressing the ancient civilization theory head on. The basic claim goes like this. Before the last ice age fully locked Antarctica under its current ice sheet, which happened gradually over millions of years but intensified significantly around 34 million years ago and again around 3 million years ago, the continent may have had conditions hospitable to life. And some researchers go further. They argue that a technologically advanced civilization could have existed in Antarctica in a period when the continent was warmer, and that the evidence of that civilization now lies beneath kilometers of ice. The Peary race map is cited as one piece of evidence. So is Graham Hancock, the British author whose books and Netflix documentary series have brought these ideas to an enormous mainstream audience. Hancock argues that a comet impact or series of impacts approximately 12,900 years ago triggered a period of rapid climate disruption called the Younger Dryas, which destroyed a technologically advanced civilization that had existed during the last ice age. He argues that survivors of this civilization carried knowledge, mathematical, astronomical, and architectural, to various parts of the world and seeded the great ancient civilizations of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Americas. And he suggests that Antarctica, which was less ice-covered at the beginning of the Younger Dryas than it is today, may have been one of the regions where this civilization existed. Here is how to think about this honestly. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, the idea that a cosmic impact triggered rapid climate change around 12,900 years ago, is a genuinely contested but legitimate area of scientific research. It is not fringe pseudoscience. Papers on the subject have been published in peer-reviewed journals. Scientists actively debate the evidence. The verdict is not in. The idea that complex civilization existed before the conventional timeline of around 5,000 years ago is much harder to support. The archaeological record for anatomically modern humans goes back roughly 300,000 years. For the vast majority of that time, the evidence shows hunter-gatherer societies of varying sophistication, not large-scale urban civilization, not writing, not complex architecture. The conventional archaeological timeline puts the emergence of complex civilization, with writing, cities, and organized states at around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia and Egypt. For an advanced civilization to have existed before that, and left no trace beyond what Hancock describes as mythological memory and architectural similarity, would require explaining why the archaeological record is so uniformly silent. For an advanced civilization to have existed before that, and left no trace beyond what Hancock describes as mythological memory and architectural similarity, would require explaining why the archaeological record is so uniformly silent. Floods destroy cities, fire destroys libraries, but stone foundations survive, metal objects survive, teeth and bones survive, and in the tens of thousands of archaeological sites excavated across every continent, we do not find the signatures of advanced pre-Ice Age civilization. What we find is exactly what the conventional timeline predicts: a long, slow development from simple to complex. So the honest position is this: the ancient Antarctica civilization theory is almost certainly wrong in its dramatic form, but the questions it raises about what we do and do not know about the deep human past are not stupid questions. They are worth asking, and the fact that a significant portion of a continent remains buried under kilometers of ice, genuinely inaccessible to direct archaeological investigation, means that the full picture cannot yet be complete. Here is something that does not make headlines, but should. Over the past 15 years, the major powers have been quietly but systematically expanding their physical presence in Antarctica. Not just maintaining existing stations, building new ones, upgrading old ones, extending runways, installing communications infrastructure, deploying icebreakers, and doing all of it under the banner of scientific research. The United States currently operates 3 year-round stations. McMurdo Station on Ross Island is the largest Antarctic station in the world, a small town of permanent buildings capable of housing over 1,000 people during the summer season. It has a harbor, an airfield, a helipad, a power plant, a sewage treatment facility, and enough infrastructure to function as a genuinely self-sufficient forward operating base. If you did not know it was called a research station and someone described it to you, you might easily think they were describing a military installation. Russia operates 5 stations in Antarctica, including Vostok Station, which sits directly above Lake Vostok in the deepest interior of East Antarctica, and Progress Station on the coast, which has been substantially upgraded in recent years, with new buildings, extended logistics capacity, and a modernized airstrip capable of handling large transport aircraft. China's 5 stations represent the most dramatic expansion of any nation's Antarctic presence in the past 2 decades. Its newest station, the Qinling Station on the Ross Sea coast, opened in February 2024. It is positioned in a part of Antarctica where no major Chinese facility previously existed, giving China a presence in a strategically significant sector of the continent. Western analysts have noted that Qinling is positioned with line of sight to satellite communication paths that are relevant to both civilian and military space operations. Now, none of this is a violation of the Antarctic Treaty. Scientific research stations are explicitly permitted, but the treaty was written in 1959 when the technology of the time defined what a research station was and what it could do. A modern Antarctic station with high bandwidth satellite communications, advanced sensors, and the infrastructure to support a significant permanent population can do things that the treaty's framers simply did not anticipate. And the inspection mechanism that is supposed to ensure transparency has been used so rarely that it functions more as a theoretical check than a practical one. Fewer than 20 formal inspections have been conducted under the treaty in over 65 years. For a continent with dozens of stations operated by dozens of nations, that works out to an inspection rate that generously could be described as occasional. So what we have is this: a continent governed by a treaty designed for a different technological era, being slowly filled with increasingly sophisticated infrastructure by nations with increasingly divergent interests, and an inspection regime that is technically real, but practically minimal. And at the center of it all, a resource ban that expires in 15 years that everyone is positioning for, but almost nobody is publicly discussing. So let us bring all of this together and ask the question that the title of this video promised to answer. What is it that governments actually know about Antarctica that they are not telling you? The honest answer has several layers. The first layer is the most mundane. Governments know a great deal about the strategic and resource value of Antarctica that they do not publicize, because publicizing it would accelerate international competition for position before they have secured their own. The seismic survey data collected by various national programs, the mineral and hydrocarbon resource assessments, the detailed mapping of subglacial topography, the strategic communications and sensor capabilities of various stations, all of this is held as national intelligence, not because it is terrifying or paradigm-shattering, but because it is valuable. And valuable information is not shared freely by governments that have competing interests. The second layer is scientific. Governments know considerably more about the trajectory of Antarctic ice loss and its implications for global sea levels than the public conversation typically reflects. The most pessimistic credible projections for Antarctic ice sheet instability are genuinely alarming, and the full weight of those projections has significant political and economic implications that create institutional pressure toward caution in how they are communicated. This is not a conspiracy. It is the ordinary dynamics of how governments manage information that could cause widespread alarm. The third layer is historical. There are aspects of what various governments did in Antarctica during the Cold War, particularly in the late 1940s and 1950s, that remain incompletely declassified. Not because what happened was necessarily extraordinary, but because the full record of Cold War activities anywhere, including in Antarctica, has been only partially released. Documents from Operation Highjump, from the early Soviet Antarctic program, from the negotiations that preceded the Antarctic Treaty, are not all in the public domain. And what is not in the public domain invites speculation. Some of that speculation is wild and unfounded, and some of it asks reasonable questions that deserve reasonable answers. The fourth layer is the one that matters most for the coming decades. Governments know that Antarctica is approaching a moment of decision. The 2041 review of the mineral ban, the accelerating loss of ice, the growing capabilities of the stations on the ice, the increasing assertiveness of China and Russia in staking their positions, all of it is converging toward a period in which the Antarctic Treaty System, the framework that has governed this continent for over 65 years, will face its most serious stress test. And the decisions made in that period will determine who controls or does not control one of the last great untouched resource frontiers on Earth. That is the real secret of Antarctica. Not a Nazi base, not a hollow Earth, not ancient pyramids built by a lost civilization. The real secret is quieter and more consequential than any of those things. It is that the world's most powerful nations have been playing a very long, very patient, very careful game on and around a continent most people never think about. And the game is approaching its most important phase right now in our lifetimes, while we are all looking somewhere else. So, where does all of this leave us? We have walked through the official history of Antarctic discovery, the extraordinary and genuine science happening under and above the ice, the real and documented military expeditions, the myths that grew up around them, the geopolitical maneuvering that is quietly accelerating, the resource stakes that are genuinely enormous, and the scientific warnings that are genuinely alarming. Here is what I think is the honest takeaway. Antarctica does not need a conspiracy to be one of the most significant and most carefully managed places on Earth. The real story, the documented story, is extraordinary enough. A continent sealed under kilometers of ancient ice, hiding mountain ranges nobody has ever seen. Lakes sealed from the world for 25 million years, living creatures that have been evolving in total isolation longer than our species has existed. The most comprehensive record of Earth's climate history anywhere on the planet. Instruments buried in the ice detecting particles from galaxies 3 billion light years away. A doomsday glacier melting in ways that could reshape the coastlines of the world. And at the center of it all, a legal framework that 15 of the most powerful nations on Earth agreed to. In 1959, in the middle of the Cold War, for reasons that have never been fully explained to the satisfaction of anyone paying close attention, is there something beneath the ice that governments are hiding? Probably not in the dramatic Hollywood sense. But are there things that governments know about Antarctica that they manage carefully, communicate selectively, and position themselves around strategically? Absolutely, without question. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is just how governments work when the stakes are high enough. And at the bottom of the world, beneath the oldest ice, in the coldest place on Earth, the stakes are about as high as they get. Antarctica is not just a frozen wasteland at the edge of the map. It is a mirror, held up to the deepest ambitions and the deepest fears of every powerful nation on Earth. And what they see in that mirror, they are not entirely ready to show you. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Someone who wants the full story, Not just the headline, not just the conspiracy, not just the official line. The real thing. Hit that like button, subscribe to Dreamtime Documents, and come back because there is so much more to explore, so much more waiting just beneath the surface. Good night.